And we'll start about 2 or 3 minutes after the hour, 12:02, 12:03.
This is great. This is our PEDS run for the for this year of COVID. So you'll be talking today, and next week I'll be talking. And so I think that's, and we also actually had Megan talking about school reopening and school equity a little bit. So yeah, so we've had 3 lectures on PEDS, which is good.
Oh, well, good. Some people will know more than I do then about some of this.
Not about the history. No, no, no. Yeah, some of our faculty have been very, very involved in COVID policy, things of that sort. So,
wow.
But as we call it here, we're hoping that we're crossing the street as well, so that some of the faculty from history and HIPS will be joining as well.
How many people do you usually have come in?
Anywhere from 70 to 100.
Oh my goodness. That's a really vibrant lecture series.
That's a lovely picture on your wall.
Oh, thank you. It sustained me through this epidemic. It seems happy and colorful, and I'm glad I'm working in this room. Our dining room has never been used so much.
No. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture in the series on ethics and the COVID-19 pandemic, medical, social, and political issues. We're honored that our speaker today will be Dr. Hughes Evans, who attended Princeton University and received her MD from Harvard Medical School, and then a PhD in the history of science, also from Harvard. Dr. Evans practices general pediatrics in inner city Atlanta and leads the Division of General Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine at Emory University. Dr. Evans worked at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where one of our fellows, Dr. Chow, is currently. But Dr. Evans worked there for 25 years and served as Dean for Students and Dean for Medical Education before moving to Emory. Dr. Evans remains actively engaged in medical education and enjoys teaching about the medical humanities. Her research has explored various aspects of the history of pediatrics, including the history of child sexual abuse and the reasons why physicians encouraged parents to institutionalize their children with Down syndrome. Dr. Evans is an avid fiction reader and gardener, and she's trying to enjoy Zoom and is grateful that her own 3 children and students can help her solve her own computer problems. The title of Dr. Evans' talk today is "The Shine Went Out of Everything, Children's Experiences in the 1918 Epidemic and Lessons for Today." So is a great honor to welcome Dr. Hughes Evans to speak to us at the University of Chicago. Dr. Evans.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that introduction. I'm very glad to be here. I wish I could be physically with you. I love Chicago, and it would have been wonderful to be with you in person today. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And everybody should be able to see that. 13 months ago, our country woke up to the reality that the contagion in Wuhan, China had entered the US and that life was about to change dramatically. I imagine each of us remembers those early days, what we were doing, where our family members were, whether we thought it would be a pandemic or would just fizzle out. Last January, I told my students that COVID had the potential to become the disease that defined their early career, their education. As a pediatrician who trained during the early days of HIV/AIDS, that disease came to define my career and stamped its imprint on my psyche. It taught me how vicious a disease could be, and it became the diagnosis that always had to be considered. The AIDS epidemic vividly taught me that disease had personal, interpersonal, and societal dimensions. It was a potent reminder that the biology of disease is only a small part of the burden of disease. As my career unfolded, I found myself waiting for that next big disease, the next diagnosis that would define an era. And I think COVID is that disease. But while HIV shaped my formative years, the disease that COVID really makes me think of is the 1918 influenza pandemic. I don't need to tell this audience about COVID or describe the havoc that it is wreaking. I do, however, find myself thinking about how we will look back on it and whether past scourges can serve as guideposts. Like previous epidemics, COVID has brought the health inequities in our society into stark relief and demonstrated the complex interplay between science, economics, politics, and culture. Most of the attention has been focused on adult patients, since that's where the majority of the morbidity and mortality reside. On the surface, it appears that children have largely escaped COVID's ravages with only minimal symptoms. Yet I would like to argue that children have indeed suffered mightily during this epidemic, and that their experiences deserve examination. As the historian Charles Rosenberg argues, epidemics are both a sampling device and a stress test that reveal the underlying drama and weak points of society. The goal of this talk then is to explore the experience of children in the 1918 epidemic and to use that as a lens to think about the current epidemic. The centennial of the Spanish flu, as it was commonly called, was recently commemorated with a spate of excellent scholarship added to the historical record. Newspapers across America plumbed their archives to retell the story of how influenza played out in their community. It was often called La Grippe and literally gripped those communities. The few remaining survivors were interviewed. Families dusted off diaries like this one here from their ancestors, and parallels between influenza and COVID were highlighted. The quarantines, masking, social distancing, dilemmas about whether and how long to close schools, theaters, churches, how to change the workplace, what the impact was on business and infrastructure, and the list goes on and on. The histories of disease are written by adults, and they rely on adult encounters about the disease. As a result, these accounts are skewed toward the adult experience and to issues paramount to them. But children experience pandemics in profound ways. I see this every day in my general pediatric clinic in inner city Atlanta. These children are barometers of the economic fallout. There's the seismographs of the emotional upheaval. and the victims of the resulting social and political turmoil. Their stories teach us about how society responds to a mass biological disaster. For those of you who don't share my mania for Spanish flu, let me provide a brief overview of that pandemic as it was felt in North America. I'm going to be talking today mostly about the US experience, but I will draw occasionally on the Canadian experience as well. Experts debate where it originated, but suffice it to say that the US first noticed a strange disease in Fort Riley, Kansas in March of 1918. And you can see that this was no regular flu. Hundreds of recruits were coming down with it. The US entered World War I in early April, and troops were rapidly mobilizing to go overseas and fight the Germans. The disease spread to civilians in the usual ways, soldiers joining home on leave, recruits kissing their sweethearts, and troops packing onto trains and ships to be shipped off to different camps, and then moving back and across international borders and across oceans. By the fall, when the horrible second wave appeared, all major North American cities were sounding the alarm that flu had come to roost. Dr. Victor Vaughn, who was the head of the Army's Communicable Disease Division and not prone to exaggeration, warned, if the epidemic continues its mathematical rate of acceleration, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth within a matter of a few more weeks. The disease hit in 3 waves: the spring of 1918, the really horrific fall of 1918, and then the spring of 1919, which lingered on for about a year. In total, over 625,000 US citizens died from the flu. Vital statistics were far from accurate at the time, but epidemiologists estimate that about 500 million people worldwide were infected, with a total death toll of 40 to 100 million worldwide. As a comparison, COVID has so far killed 3 million worldwide, with about 570,000 US deaths. The concurrence of the pandemic with a world war undeniably fueled its deadliness. This is a hastily set up Army tent hospital outside of Boston when the recruits there started coming down with flu symptoms. More soldiers died of the flu than of war injuries. In fact, mortality from flu that year outnumbered all other 20th century combat-related deaths combined. And you can see this is the flu deaths, and then 546,000 were the total deaths of other 20th century wars that the US was involved in. Soldiers packed into transport ships, making contagion spread easily and efficiently. The conditions on the front, with its damp foxholes and cramped quarters, further stoked the epidemic fire. The disease is often called the Spanish flu because Spain had not yet entered the war and thus was not censoring its news. It was the only major European country to report on the pandemic and thus was blamed for causing it. Flu was no stranger to us. In fact, it was a yearly visitor, plowing through communities each winter. Some years were mild, while others were severe. Its victims were mostly the very young and the very old. And this is a curve, the dotted line is the typical flu curve where the young children and older adults were its victims. The death curves were then called U-shaped because of its predilection for those ages at the extremes. But this influenza, which was an H1N1 strain, was different. Adults in the 20 to 40-year-old age group seemed particularly vulnerable, and the death curve carried an ominous W shape. There's a lot been made out of this W shape. So you can see this shape being compared to the flu years prior to 1918, and in this graph, the U-shaped curve resumes in 1920, in this case, 1928-29 flu year. When the pandemic hit, especially during the virulent second wave, the available doctors went into overdrive. Doctors and nurses were in short supply. About 1/4 to 1/3 of all US doctors and nurses had been sent to the front. Poet and general practitioner William Carlos Williams had been in practice for about a decade when influenza ripped through his town of Rutherford, New Jersey. He described the melee saying, "We doctors were making up to 60 calls a day. Several of us were knocked out. One of the younger of us died. Others caught the thing, and we hadn't a thing that was effective in checking that potent poison that was sweeping the world." Doctors were so busy that one woman recalled her 15-year-old brother driving their physician father so that he could sleep in the back seat between house calls. The Red Cloud, Nebraska newspaper claimed the doctor was, quote, "as busy as a dog with 2 sets of fleas," end quote. There were no flu tests. Diagnosis was entirely clinical, and treatment was supportive. In other words, harried physicians relied on simple measures to support the victim through the disease course. Although numerous panaceas were falsely advertised, treatment mainstays were reducing fever and avoiding dehydration and malnutrition while the body fought the pestilence. Antibiotics would not be discovered for another 2 decades, and antivirals were even further off. The flu did not behave like the typical flu. Not only was it more contagious and deadly, but deaths were grisly, some within hours of developing symptoms and others over days to weeks from a secondary bacterial pneumonia. In the worst cases, almost before the eyes of onlookers, the infected person's skin grew ashen then blue. And here is a drawing from the time of a flu victim, and you can see the purplish discoloration of his skin and lips. Dramatic cases were often described like this: your face turns a dark brownish purple. You start to cough up blood, your feet turn black. Finally, as the end nears, you frantically grasp for breath. A blood-tinged saliva bubbles out of your mouth. You die by drowning, actually, as your lungs fill with a reddish fluid. As William Carlos Williams remembered, they'd be sick one day and gone the next, just like that, fill up and die. Other patients experienced a longer course over days to weeks, complicated by bacterial pneumonia, a really dangerous diagnosis in the pre-antibiotic era. This is a graph showing the experience in New York City over the second wave. And you can see the patients were roughly half diagnosis dying from pneumonia and half from influenza, but there was just this enormous spike in deaths from influenza or the secondary pneumonia that complicated it. There really are many, many stories to tell about influenza. The role of race and immigrant nationality, the futile hunt for the cure, the successful hunt for the virus that actually caused it, the story of how it played out around the world, the story on the domestic front. And today I'll focus on the most domestic of fronts, how it impacted homes and especially the children living in those homes. While most influenza histories focus on those adults who were sickened in their prime, children, especially those under 5, caught the disease and died in remarkably large numbers that have mostly been ignored. So here's a graph of Michigan's experience in 1918, and it was created to show the impact on those adults in the 20 to 40 age range. But as you can see, the group that's impacted the second most severely are the children under 10, with roughly half and half having dying from either the influenza or the secondary pneumonia. In Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, children under 5 constituted 8% of the population and 14% of the deaths. Indiana reported that 22% of the deaths during those last months of 1918 were in children under 5. The children at highest risk of death were under 1, the group that often succumbed to the yearly flu. Despite the higher than normal numbers of child deaths, these deaths, as I said, seem to have been forgotten. Perhaps they were simply absorbed into the collective belief that the very young were always vulnerable to the annual flu script and to other causes of infant and child mortality. As Charles Rosenberg argues, these yearly flu deaths in particular and infant mortality in general were part of the, quote, background noise of everyday life in America. But for whatever reason, histories of the flu gloss over its impact on infants and children. Despite its virulence, most children, especially the school-aged, survived the disease and some never got sick. Education was often disrupted as towns and cities temporarily shuttered schools, along with altering work schedules and closing other gathering spots like movie theaters and churches. The decision to close school was controversial. Some public health experts saw schools and school children as sources of infection, but others touted the safety of the school hygiene measures and worried instead about the risks of keeping children at home. Cities like New York and Chicago opted to keep schools open, arguing that school buildings were more hygienic than the tenements where 3/4 of school children resided, and that a robust system of medical inspection by school nurses could identify cases early and protect the populace. Some cities imposed these so-called non-pharmaceutical measures early on, while others resisted making unpopular edicts that might negatively impact morale or economics. A group of historians studied 46 cities and demonstrated that US cities that restricted school attendance and public gatherings early fared much better than the cities that took a laxer or much later approach. School closures tended to be limited to the worst weeks of the epidemic, unlike what we're seeing, which is a much more prolonged school closure. Some school officials believed that schools offered a safe alternative for children from unstable homes and worried about the risk children face in abusive homes and lax environments during an epidemic. Uninfected children often assumed additional household duties as their parents and siblings struggled with the infection. Caring for sick family members who had been confined to beds by their doctors was both tedious and taxing. In Mendota, Illinois, 19-year-old Hilda Zack, shown here on the front of the book, which is a collection of her diaries from that period, she described the labor involved in caring for her mother and 7 younger siblings who had been stricken with the flu. She hoisted them onto bedpans, she bathed them, administered medicines, changed their sweaty clothes and sheets, and made special food thought to be more palatable for the ill. In addition, she walked to town to fetch medicines, bought groceries and supplies, and returned home to do her own chores, as well as the duties that her mother had done and her other siblings had done. Now, Hilda's family was comfortably well off, and they were able to hire a private nurse to help with the care of the sick. And they all recovered, which in many families were not so fortunate. The flu's predilection for young adults caused a surge in newly orphaned children. Very little has been written about the pandemic orphans, although it's interesting because newspaper articles from the time are replete with stories about them. Cities in the throes of the pandemic contended with a flood of children whose parents were either too ill to care for them or who had died and left their children homeless. Verging on the sentimental, these articles nevertheless highlight one of the epidemic's most traumatic byproducts. At the turn of the century, a child who lost one or both parents was referred to as an orphan or as a semi-orphan. In the worst scenario, when both parents died, 4 options existed, more or less. Extended family members would arrange to take in the children, often dividing them amongst several family members. The community may play a similar role, stepping in to care for the youngsters. Some children would become wards of the state, and rarely children would attempt to fend for themselves. During the epidemic, many orphanages were unable to accept new inmates until they could control the quarantines and infections that existed inside their own walls. Cities tasked children's aid societies and religious institutions with caring for displaced youngsters in the interim. Many locales hurriedly built orphanages to accommodate the parentless, homeless children. Orphanages, in turn, saw adoption as the optimal outcome for these young occupants. And this was in part because they felt that their homes were, these children often came from tenements, and they felt their homes were not worth returning to. Many orphans were loaded onto orphan trains to be adopted, often into servitude across the country. This was from a Kansas story in which there were 6 siblings who had been orphaned in Pennsylvania. The youngest was felt to be too young to put on an orphan train and was adopted in Pennsylvania. The other 5 were adopted by several families in a Mennonite community in Kansas, where they were able to actually see each other. Not all siblings were able to stay together or stay nearby each other. Given the virulence of the flu, parents often died within days of each other, causing unbearable grief for the children and overtaxing the existing social support systems. This graph shows that married women in particular, and you can see here are young married women between 15 and 24, their death rates were quite a bit higher than men. And then married women in the 25 to 44 year age group also with higher death rates than men. And interesting, widowed men seem to have a very high death rate as well. So these married young adults seem to have a particularly high death rate. In the days before birth control, these young adults were likely to have children, in fact, often many children. Stories like that of the Kuhlman family in Pennsylvania peppered the newspapers. Within a span of 4 days, Mr. and Mrs. Kuhlman and 2 of their 9 children died. The remaining 7 children were adopted and grew up in 7 different homes, rarely seeing each other. Large families were common, and most adopted families were unable and often unwilling to take in so many children at once. A father's death meant a family lost its major breadwinner. Many mothers faced destitution without their husband's income to support the family. Widows were forced to find employment in underpaying jobs and to allocate a portion of their paltry income toward childcare. Out of economic desperation, many women appealed to local charities for assistance, and some made the excruciating decision to turn over 1 or more children to an orphanage. Usually this was meant to be a temporary thing, but sometimes for a variety of reasons, the orphanage stay became permanent. The Children's Home and Aid Society of Illinois reported that in the epidemic's aftermath, the number of widows seeking assistance jumped 60%. When mothers died, fathers also struggled to care for their offspring, especially the ones too young to care for themselves. Turn of the century gender roles dictated that women kept house, washed and clothed the children, did the laundry and mending, bought the groceries, made the meals, responsibilities that amounted to a full-time, though uncompensated job that most men were unprepared and unwilling to perform. Like widows, widowers often found themselves overwhelmed and unable to manage, and they turned to neighbors if they had them, or to orphanages until they could find a way to care for their offspring. The picture on this slide, the smallest child, when her mother died, her father turned her over to relatives to raise. And that was a fairly common scenario, the father feeling unprepared to raise a child on his own. Many were forced to leave school and start contributing to the family's income. After his father died in September 1918 in the Boston area, 9-year-old Alfred earned money selling newspapers, working in rag shops, and washing dishes. Some widowers expected an older daughter to leave school and become the housekeeper for the family. In Albany, a 13-year-old girl was taken to an institution when her parents became ill and her mother died. After her father recovered, he wanted her to return home to keep house for him. And the newspaper reported that she said, "But I don't want to leave here," she sobbed to the supervising nun at the institution. A special situation was pregnancy. Pregnant women were at high risk of dying with the flu. Fatality rates in infected pregnant women ranged from 23 to 71%. Physicians in Chicago reported that 45% of hospitalized pregnant women with the flu died. What's more, the babies frequently died or were born stillborn. Even if the baby survived the risky pregnancy, its chance of survival was low if the mother had died. Newspapers frequently described families in which the mother and her newborn had passed away. For instance, a Philadelphia article reported that, quote, "Mrs. Fred Mall was in Philadelphia hospital with influenza, her 3 small children malnourished. A day earlier, the flu had took her husband in their ramshackle home. A few hours later, she gave birth to another child at home who died within minutes," end quote. This is a picture from the cover of Emma Donohue's well-researched novel, The Pull of the Stars. And it takes place in an Irish maternity ward in 1918 and strikingly describes the dangers to pregnant and laboring women, as well as the risks taken by the nurses, doctors, and hospital staff during the epidemic. And as I mentioned here, the word influenza comes from the Latin meaning an astrological or influence or visitation, hence the pull of the stars. The situation was equally dire for orphan siblings who tried to avoid institutionalization and fend for themselves. When the 8 Bowles children lost both parents, they decided to stick together, with the 18-year-old eldest daughter heading the household. She played the violin at a local restaurant to support her younger siblings, but they had to resort to other forms of assistance, like getting food at a soup kitchen. Despite her efforts, the Bowles children resorted to temporarily placing their 2-year-old youngest sibling at St. Anne's Asylum. There's really no national data about the number of children orphaned by the flu, and the scope of the problem remains obscure. Cities and charities across the country struggle to meet the acute needs of these children. At the end of 1918, New York City alone reported that it faced nearly 21,000 orphans that had newly created in a matter of weeks. Whereas here, as you can see, Pennsylvania said that they had 45,000 orphans in the Keystone State. Nurses and volunteer aid workers entered homes in which illness had been reported and found parents who were gravely ill and dying or dead, and children who were sick or starving. These aid societies used these stories to raise awareness of the problem and appeal to the charitable nature of concerned citizens. Calls went out for monetary contributions as well as donations and for food, clothing, and supplies. And in some cases, cities requested emergency volunteers to adopt orphaned children. Temporary children's homes arose to accommodate the surge of children, and emergency hospitals absorbed the ill of all ages. This is a high school in Pasadena, California, that changed itself into a hospital. And as you can see, in the very center of the picture is a nurse taking the pulse of a child who's ill. Looks like, from what I can tell, it looks like this is a hospital. This was the ward for women and children. In Worcester, Massachusetts, Mrs. John McInnes responded to the problem by turning her own home into an orphanage. And when little Edward's mother died, his father placed one of his children in an orphanage, but tried to keep Edward at home, but found that working all day and paying strangers to take care of Edward didn't appeal to him. So he made the difficult decision to turn Edward over to St. Anne's. "It's the only way," he told them. Religious organizations stepped in to care for these children, but also saw it as an opportunity to save souls. Catholic sisters in Pennsylvania proudly reported their efforts to help the, quote, poor unbelieving Jews, end quote, and poor foreigners who could barely speak a word of English, end quote. And they said They were a strange medley of races and nationalities. Jews were numerous. Several Jewish babies were baptized who died. The little tots took great delight in blessing themselves and babbling aspirations. End quote. Catholic nuns risked their own lives to care for these families, and their role in the community fight against the contagion was critical and indeed courageous. However, they didn't hesitate to use this as an opportunity to convert the heathen. And while this isn't a picture of Catholic nuns, it is a picture of a Catholic school taking care of children who were sick. So not surprisingly, most histories of the epidemic reflect the urban experience. Cities with their crowded tenements and bustling streets offered potent breeding grounds for contagion. But the flu quickly spread from metropolitan to rural areas, and few communities escaped its clutches. Fortunately, small town newspapers, diaries, and letters documented life during those fateful months and demonstrate the unique challenges faced by rural citizens. Here's a picture of the Hermansen family taken in 1919 at the tail end of the epidemic. Shortly thereafter, the mother and 6 of the 12 children died within a week. The father and 2 other children were hospitalized, and other family members as well as neighbors helped feed and take care of the farm while the rest of the family was recovering. This was in Minnesota. Montana was particularly hard hit, losing 1% of its population. Widely scattered farms lacked nearby neighbors to help when people got sick, and doctors were far away. For instance, a family of 5 outside of Miles City, Montana, starved to death when they caught the flu because they were too weak to feed themselves. Here's another farmed rural family in a German community called Freistadt, Missouri. The father had died of measles, and then the mother died from influenza in 1919. Leaving the 5 children as orphans, they were divided up 4 different sets of aunts and uncles. And in this picture, the 2 children holding hands in the center of the picture were the only 2 children who were raised together, although this family was, they all lived fairly close to each other and maintained close relationships. Farm families in Saskatchewan were similarly impacted. When Dora Fisher's parents contracted the flu, she and her sister had to do all the farm chores. They drove the team to the well, retrieved water in barrels on the sleigh, fed and watered the animals, milked the cows, and kept the fires burning in the house to stay warm. Sister Mary Cecil looked back on her childhood and recalled that as her family members sickened, it fell on her to her 9-year-old brother to drive the car into town to replenish the supply of baby food. Within a span of 3 days, her father, sister, and mother died. There were no funerals, she recalled. The dead were simply buried. And Jean Hudson recalled that her father's symptoms came on so quickly while he was driving home in the snow from the train station that he tied the horses to the sleigh, letting them make their way home on their own. Soon after, the entire family was bedridden. Her 13-year-old brother mustered the energy to trudge to a neighbor's place for assistance. 5 days later, her father passed away, leaving her mother to care for 7 children under 16. While small towns lacked the congestion that facilitated infectious spread, once the flu arrived in the country, the distance made getting the essentials for survival and medical aid more difficult. The remoteness of farm life and the winter cold intensified the flu's dangers for rural families, but barely begin to describe the tragedy that unfolded for Native American children and their families. The indigenous peoples of Alaska called the flu the big sickness because of its destructive force. The disease reportedly arrived on the SS Victoria, a ship delivering mail to Nome, Alaska, and quickly spread, killing 1,500 to 2,000 people. A Nome school teacher visited 10 small villages and reported that 3 were wiped out entirely and others suffered 85% mortality. According to the school teacher, 300 children urgently required care, and most of them were now orphans aged 5 to 14. Fathers and mothers became too weak to chop wood, to stay warm, leaving their families literally freezing. Some estimate that 25% of the victims froze to death in the bitter Arctic winter. So many children were orphaned that the town of Wales in Alaska reorganized itself, appointing surviving adults to marry each other in a mass ceremony so that they could adopt the children of their dead friends. The large number of adult deaths meant that children were sent to boarding schools where they were acculturated at the price of preserving their language and culture. Influenza behaved differently in these small, remote hamlets, with such virulence and appalling mortality that experts have likened it to a virgin soil epidemic. For the indigenous people of Grenfell Mission in Labrador, the flu struck the place like a cyclone, wrote Reverend Henry Gordon. Whole houses lay inanimate all over their kitchen floors, unable to feed themselves or look after the fire. It was very upsetting, people crying, children dying everywhere, he added. Close-knit Inuit communities like Okok on the Labrador coast were stretched to the breaking point. A supply ship making its semi-annual stop in Okok brought the flu in November 1918, and over the next month and a half, 204 of its 263 residents died. Grief-stricken, the few survivors abandoned Okok the following summer to resettle in other Inuit towns. One of the missionaries noted that the flu changed the survivors of Okok. It seemed the people had lost faith, he said. These tight-knit communities experienced a cultural death, losing centuries-old traditional practices. Into this void stepped missionaries and teachers intent upon inculcating new knowledge, ideas, and traditions. Stories such as these highlight the fact that pandemics are not simply a viral invasion on its human host. Social, cultural, political, geographic, and religious factors shape both the experience of the disease as well as its outcome. The Navajo, like the indigenous peoples living near the Arctic, experienced an appalling death rate, in part because their immune systems were naive to the infection. One outbreak originated in a boarding school in Tuba City, Arizona, infecting many pupils. The disease quickly spread to the community, creating chaos. First-hand reports describe how the flu initially claimed the lives of small children and the elderly, but soon took strong men and women. One woman, named Tall Woman, recalled that the flu, quote, seemed to really hit the young children. Little children all over the area were dying day and night, night after night, unquote. This pattern differed from reports in other parts of the US where school-age children were relatively spared. Albert Reagan, an employee with the US Indian Service and anthropologist at Brigham Young University, corroborated the impact on children, noting that children under 15 made up just over half of the Navajo, yet accounted for 60% of the deaths. With families living far apart and people running away from the disease in terror, some Navajo children were left behind and others found starving. Reagan's stories were poignant. Several related families living together all died, but one small boy who was found herding the combined flocks of sheep, he said. Another family fled only to die one by one along the trail, leaving one small boy so small that he is unable to give his parents' name. The dispersed nature of Navajo life, the tradition of abandoning places of death, the lack of Native immunity, the limited support available from the federal government, and the lack of trust between the Navajo and the government further hampered efforts to treat ailing Navajo. I think we can all imagine the devastation of losing a parent or sibling and the long-term effects it might have on a growing child who is trying to make sense of a world that seemed senseless. The psychological impact on a child would vary based on their development, environment, and whether they had loving adults to shepherd them through their grief. Poverty and destitution would only add injury to insult. The 20th century novelist, essayist, and critic Mary McCarthy was orphaned at the age of 6 when her entire family came down with the flu while traveling from Seattle to Minneapolis. Upon reaching their destination, the family was so sick that stretchers were used to remove them from the train. They were taken to her grandparents' home, and her parents died shortly thereafter. As she later wrote, being an orphan came to define her. She said, "We became aware, even as we woke from our fevers, that everything, including ourselves, was different." Adding, "Our value had paled, and a new image of ourselves, the image of the orphan, was already forming in our minds." Not only did she and her brothers lose a happy and loving home life, but they lost the memories that her parents would have imparted and helped to shape the way children see the world. She and her brothers were shuttled around between family members, sometimes separated from each other, and often feeling like unloved burdens to the adults tasked with caring for them. The psychological harm of the influenza epidemic is impossible to measure and has never been really surveyed well, and was only recorded in a hit or miss fashion. While there are many happy stories of children who survived and found love in new families, there are also tales of children who were traumatized by the loss of a parent, compounded by the economic hardship resulting from the flu. The indigenous communities tragically lost not only many people, but a way of life and the people who could pass along their heritage. Some children were hardened by the experience. A Boston man recalled the detrimental impact of the flu on his father, whose own father, shown in this picture, had died when he was 9. This Bostonian wrote, "The damage done by the flu virus didn't end with the loss of life. My grandfather wasn't there to guide his son, to teach him how to love a family, to live in the world, to provide the comfort of being cared for. The wounds of that little boy festered in the man who would become our father, spewing forth into the life he would create with his own family. The social skills my father never learned would cross the line from discipline to punishment, an underlying current of violence permeating our lives." William Maxwell, who served as fiction editor at The New Yorker for almost 40 years, provided, in my opinion, the most eloquent portrayal of the emotional toll of the pandemic. They Came Like Swallows, his semi-autobiographical novel, tells the story of a family experiencing the flu as it unfolded and the death of a much-loved mother from the perspective of her husband and their 2 young sons, one of whom is Maxwell's alter ego. Maxwell clearly embodies his characters with the bewilderment surrounding an unfolding pandemic, as well as the grief of losing a mother. As Maxwell poignantly later explained, "My childhood came to an end at that moment. The worst that could happen had happened, and the shine went out of everything." For Maxwell, the death of a parent was shattering and marked the transition from a happy childhood to a world in which the unutterable could occur. Maxwell later reflected on how the flu impacted his life, saying, "The effect of my mother's death was that I realized for the first time and forever that we were not safe, that we were not beyond harm. From that time on, there was a sadness which had not existed before. There was a deep down sadness that never quite went away because I knew people aren't safe. Nobody's safe. Terrible things can happen to anybody." Now, Maxwell grew up as a white child of middle-class privilege in a small town in Illinois, so different from so many of the flu's victims. Yet his sadness still resonates and reminds us of how a child's psyche can be injured. His novel stands out as a lone voice of the child's experience in that horrible epidemic and offers a rare glimpse into how epidemics alter a child's life. There's a danger in comparing 2 epidemics. The retrospectroscope is a fickle machine, and we run the risk of drawing unfair, inaccurate, and ahistorical conclusions. After all, a lot has changed since 1918. We aren't in the middle of a world war. 50% of Americans lived on farms a century ago, compared to less than 25% today. Computers, communication platforms, and transportation have created a far more connected world that moves at speeds that seemed impossible a century ago. Science and medicine have made advances too numerable to enumerate. Rights for women and minorities have advanced. Children attend school uniformly now. We have many more single-parent households. But despite these changes over the last century, and indeed they are profound changes, I think the 1918 epidemic offers several lessons. First, huge numbers of orphans are one of the biggest tragedies of the 1918 epidemic. These children met a variety of fates, some uplifting, others tragic. The American Academy of Pediatrics recently reported that approximately 40,000 children have been orphaned by COVID. And while this number is much lower than those orphaned by the Spanish flu, we should pause and consider the ramifications of such enormous loss. The response in 1918 was to find shelter, food, and eventually a home for orphans, often with religious instruction thrown in. Today, I think we need to consider how to do more than provide these basic necessities and to tend to the grief these children experience in the face of such staggering loss. Secondly, I think the trauma inflicted by the deaths of loved ones, as well as by the economic fallout of an epidemic, can have lifelong effects, particularly during vulnerable developmental stages. What we now call ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, were at the time chalked up to the school of hard knocks, to racial and ethnic traits, and to poverty. The science of ACEs should prompt us to try to assist these children and create resilience in the face of adversity. A common ditty from 1918, sung by jump roping children, reminds me of children's ability to persist and even see joy in the face of difficulty. We need to develop strategies to help children who are devastated by loss and the byproducts of pandemics. And economic instability is harmful to children. I see this every day in my practice when parents come in and have lost their low-paying jobs and are desperate to find money to feed, clothe, and house their children. Orphanages and aid societies were the imperfect answer to this problem in 1918, and we need to build better social systems that support families in financial distress. Third, schools play critical roles in pandemics. We need to be aware of the risks and benefits associated with schooling. The school hygiene and medical inspection programs in place in 1918 in some cities were important tools that actually checked the epidemic. Our society is not as comfortable with this type of surveillance, but it's clearly had some benefits. Some children may be physically and mentally safer at school rather than at home. As a pediatrician, I can tell that quarantines are pressure cookers for family dysfunction, with spikes noted in domestic violence, alcohol and drug abuse, and child abuse. Teachers are our most vigilant watchdogs for child well-being and mandated reporters for abuse and neglect. Without schools, we may be allowing abuse and neglect to continue. During COVID, we have actually mixed reports about its impact on abuse. In some reports, there are a higher proportion of ED visits or child abuse than what was seen in prior times, and more severe abuse report coming into the emergency room. There are conflicting reports, with a recent report saying that it hasn't changed. Schools are important places for learning that promote child development and socialization. And we don't know what the long-term developmental results of virtual schooling will be. But I feel it's pretty clear, seeing my patients, that the education attainment gap is widening. When we look at epidemics in population-wide ways, we run the risk of ignoring groups who are more vulnerable to the disease than others. I feel like inner city children are one of those groups that have tended to be ignored. They feel the economic disruption in ways that affluent children are ignored of. Are we deepening the gap between the haves and the have-nots? The death of leaders and older adults in close-knit communities can lead to the loss of culture and disrupt a child's sense of belonging to a family and to a historically vibrant group. We need to be on the lookout for these vulnerable groups. Elders in many minority communities are the most at risk of dying from COVID. Efforts to provide assistance often were not culturally sensitive and reflected prevailing biases against minorities. I didn't talk about this a lot because there's not a lot of data about the experience of minority children in the epidemic, but we know that African Americans face systemic racism and were blamed for living in conditions that promoted the flu, even though there is data to suggest that they experienced milder disease in 1918. Immigrants were similarly blamed for fueling the epidemic. All too often, humans blame already marginalized groups for perpetuating epidemics, and this behavior entrenches the existing malignant bigotry. And finally, the impact of the flu epidemic on children, I think I've said this before, has been ignored. We're at risk for doing the same with the COVID epidemic today. According to the United Nations Children's Fund, children are not the face of this pandemic, but they risk becoming its biggest victims. For some children, the impact will be lifelong. The harmful effects are expected to be most damaging for children in already disadvantaged or vulnerable situations. Historians' inquiries into the lasting repercussions of epidemics are by necessity viewed through the frame of adults. But children may be society's most sensitive bellwether of a pandemic's impact. Modern research teaches us that when children experience adversity, it alters their development and leads to long-term negative health consequences. The biological, social, and economic fallout of COVID-19 will compound these ACEs. As David Jones warned in a recent New England Journal article, epidemics reveal what really matters to a population and whom they truly value. When historians of the future look back on today's pandemic, my hope is that they take note of children's experiences and listen for the children's voices. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions.
First, I'm going to start with wow. That was sobering. Our first question comes from, no, actually, it's not even a question. The audience is just starting to say thank you, just like I am, and pretty overwhelmed. So given what we know now, I'm just going to ask a small little question is, what should we be doing about schools? Should we just be reopening them?
You know, I wish I had a great answer to that question. I think that, of course, the answer is going to be it depends. But I think for the majority of children, we, at least right now, given the current state of variance and everything else, school is pretty safe for kids. And schools have figured out ways to do it safely. So we don't have all of the supports in place, I think, to help make sure it's safe for everyone. But I think we are moving to a place where school really is safe especially for younger children.
So it's an interesting because at least right now at many school districts, parents are being given the choice. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, that's going to even further exacerbate the disparities.
Exactly. I had a patient the other day whose child was failing in school, was clearly struggling, had done well before, and the mother would not, their school system was allowing children to come back, but the mother wouldn't allow her child to come back because the mother herself had been on a ventilator with COVID. And she was terrified, in some ways irrationally, that about what her child getting the disease. So I think, some of this is information, some of it is misinformation that's impacting people's decisions. But the other thing I feel like I didn't talk about in the talk is the impact on families. Their parents are struggling so much trying to manage their work lives and their home lives and teaching their children at the same time. So the impact, I think, is really, really harmful.
So you did mention that there was a lot of school closures for short periods of time during the 1918. Mm-hmm. I just, since I don't know enough about the era, how much impact did that have long-term on those individuals? Because right now we're talking about that this generation is going to be really harmed long-term economically as well as health, as we know from education. How much do they say for those who survive the impact of school closures for small periods of time?
There's no data. No one studied it. Closures tended to be shorter, so your sense of being able to a lot of kids were able to catch up. Some schools continued for later into the summer to kind of make up for lost time. It varied a lot. Every town had its own school system, sometimes several, so it really varied a lot. And I think the fact that it was for shorter periods of time made a big difference. I think there were also a lot of kids who left school and never came back, especially if you were poor and you were thrown into economic, crisis. Those children, like that one I, quoted, immediately just went into the workforce. Even in 1918, when they were trying to reduce children's child labor, it was going from 14 hours a day down to 12 or 10 hours a day would be acceptable. So.
Well, we're really worried about that currently too, right? There are just, like New York City and Chicago talk about the thousands of children who have not been accounted for this year.
Yes. Yeah, and I think, these studies, they never happened in 1918, so it'll be really, but they will happen with COVID, the sense of what is the attainment gap and how is it impacted, based on your, the school system you're in, your level of affluence, all of those kinds of things, which I feel sure make a huge difference. So it was interesting that some big cities like Chicago decided to stay open, despite a lot of people, a lot of parents not letting their children go, but they still remained open while other cities closed. And so it was really varied quite a bit.
So did it differ by politics like it has this time in just the flavor of that state, that community, that county?
I don't know the answer to that for sure. I do know that some people that there was a lot of pressure to, because of the economic reasons to open back up. And so politics were definitely being played, but I don't know if it differed by whether you were, what your political party was. But city leaders would put pressure on public health officials and school superintendents or superintendents of school systems to make these decisions that would protect. But so many school systems had nurses that you could actually survey the school and make sure that anybody who was remotely ill was sent home. And then those nurses would go to the child's home to see how the child was doing. So this is a far cry from what we provide today.
Really? So most schools, I'm assuming this is urban, or is it also urban?
It's all urban. That would all be urban. So the big cities had very robust public health departments and had sort of an army of school nurses that would be present every day in the school, checking temperatures and for symptoms, and then would follow up by going to the tenements to check on the children.
Mark, you look like
I can't imagine anybody did that today.
I just wanted to ask if there's any understanding of why children are so relatively safe and protected from COVID, in contrast, let's say, to 1918, when they were so heavily involved in the flu. Is there some sense of understanding of that?
So, I'm on shaky ground here. I'm not an expert on COVID biology, but I think children are felt to be relatively protected because they don't mount such an exaggerated immune response when they get the disease, whereas adults have a much more exaggerated immune response. Some children will have a mild infection and then get an exaggerated response, which in children is called MISC, or multi-inflammatory syndrome of childhood. I think with the flu, the big question was why were these young adults so susceptible? And it was typical for school-age children to not have much flu. So that was sort of normal, but why would the young adults be so susceptible? And they seem to have had a very strong inflammatory response as well. So perhaps they were having this exaggerated response. Some people have argued that maybe a lot of them had tuberculosis and sort of underlying simmering tuberculosis, and the combination was deadly. There's lots of theories out there. Their T-cell responses and things like that, but it really is all theories. Interesting, but it's really hard to prove it.
Eric Weil writes from the audience, were any data collected on suicide rates during or soon after the 1918 flu? Any lessons learned from that pandemic that we may be able to apply to address mental health challenges with COVID?
That's a really good question. And, I was thinking there were, I never saw any data, although it might exist, because I was really focusing on children. Now we're seeing a lot of mental health problems in children with a lot of anxiety, depression, and suicidality, especially in the teens. And I'm maybe wrong, but I assumed that existed in 1918, but was just kind of part of the general sort of torpor that everybody felt and the grief that they were living through. They just kind of absorbed it as this was what people were going to go through because had been such a horrific event. I would love to look more into the issue of mental health in the wake of such an enormous tragedy. We know from more recent tragedies, Katrina, AIDS, that there are definitely mental health outcomes. So I assume they were there for 1918, but I felt like we came close to seeing it in William Maxwell's discussion of how he was impacted. But it's all these little one-offs, these small stories that are. The other thing you often hear is that, especially recently, when people have become interested in influenza again, they ask their great aunts and uncles and grandparents, what was it like? And they find out for the first time that, great aunt Sally had 4 siblings who died, and she's never talked about them before. So there is sort of this suppressed grief that I think of as sort of the way depression kind of evolved over time, was into just suppressing it. In fact, people used to call the influenza epidemic the forgotten pandemic because it just was not talked about until really a book came out in the 1990s, and that's when people first started talking about it again. Everyone assumed that all of that death during that time was from the war, not from flu, and it was mostly from flu. To me, the other thing that I see all the time, and I bet, Lainey, you see this as well, is children their lives have become so sedentary because they are doing everything at home, and they're gaining so much weight. So there's data about adults gaining weight. And, in our workroom, we laugh about the freshman 15 for college students and the COVID-19 for all of our patients. But it's to me, I think it's alarming, the degree of weight gain that we're seeing in small children. It's almost universal, with the exception of some children whose eating disorders have been triggered by the pandemic.
Definitely agree. Seeing lots of it, and of course, we're also seeing lots of diabetes for the last 20 years in teenagers, and so that's just going to become astronomical in the next 5 to 10 years because of this.
Yeah. And I really think that it's unlikely that was a side effect from the influenza epidemic. Food was just not as available. It certainly wasn't as processed. And you didn't have a choice to have a sedentary life. You had to walk everywhere to get wherever you needed to go. So I just think that was not, it wasn't available. It wasn't something that it could not be an outcome of it in 1918, where it's very easy for it to be an outcome today.
Great. Well, I think you've answered all the questions from the chat. Anybody, any last comments or questions? Brian, I see you coming up.
Yes, hi, Hugh. Thank you very much for this talk. So I'm one of the sort of co-organizers, but I was rounding, and so sorry I'm coming in late. I'm interested in sort of collective memory, and as it relates to children, thinking, I can't help but think, right, that this pandemic was very well recorded. Right, like on a sort of the individual, like we have phones, we're taking videos, we're taking pictures of the moment, our kids in masks, like kids on playgrounds, like all of those sort of things. And I'm just wonder how that might shape as they get older and start asking questions about what it was like. And we show them these images, we show them these videos that record things that maybe make it not look so bad. Do you have any sense of how, or suggestions, thoughts about how the collective memory of this sort of generation that's growing up as children, how their collective memory might be shaped by all of this technology that has recorded the moment, but maybe not some of those more tedious moments, of parents trying to keep everything together, or remote schooling, but that we may shape their collective memory to make it look like the pandemic was a bit easier than it actually really was.
It's a really interesting question, and it made me think back on a really wonderful documentary that was made about the influenza pandemic in probably around 1990, in which one of the survivors talked about having it as a child. She was really sick with it, but she said, and it was fun. We had fun. We saw people. I think it is part of it's a human thing to try to see the world through rose-colored glasses. But we have a lot of recorded, we have a lot of ways of recording the actual experience. And I think this pandemic will be surveyed to death in some ways. As a historian, we worry about, will we be able to retrieve all of those text messages of distress and emails? I don't know how well those things will survive. I am so grateful for the diaries and the letters that have survived from 1918. So I wonder what the loss of some of that will be like and how that will shape the experience. I feel like there's a lot that's out there about how hard it is. The New York Times had a series asking mothers what their experience was like, and it was essentially like reading a whole bunch of primal screams, So I think that is there, and that will help balance out some of the rose-colored glasses. We had fun in spite of the pandemic part of the story. Of course, who knows? We're still in the middle of it. I have no idea when this thing's going to end. I wish I knew. It felt funny trying to draw conclusions on something that wasn't even, I don't know where we are. Are we halfway done? Are we 3/4 of the way done? I don't know.
I have one outrageous question to ask. Currently, there are 3 million deaths in the world, of which close to 600,000 are in the US, despite the fact that the US has roughly 4% of the world population. Mm-hmm. Help me with the contrast to the 1918 influenza epidemic, where we had 650,000 deaths, but that was out of 40 to 100 million deaths worldwide. That is to say, proportionally, we were very low in contrast to the COVID, in which proportionally we're probably the leading, if not first or second, country in the world in terms of preference. Is there anything that comes to mind to account for that dramatic difference?
Well, I think this is where politics comes in big. If you look at governments that have really handled this beautifully, you can draw some really big comparisons. You look at Germany, you look at New Zealand, you look at other places like that, Israel. They've done a much better job of controlling the epidemic, whereas we had faulty leadership that was not willing to really support the necessary public health measures that needed to take place. I mean, to me, it all comes down to bad leadership.
Thank you.
And that
I might be unpopular for saying that.
Not in Chicago. On that happy note, I just want to say on behalf of all of us, thank you very much. This will give about 14 minutes before the fellows will meet with you. It's at a different Zoom address. And just thank you, because it was really a sobering talk, and it's something we all need to be thinking about in the next years ahead, as whether we come to an end to this pandemic or we continue, how can we really protect our vulnerable children?
Hear, hear.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.